Good evening. Good evening, my friends. Thank you for turning out tonight. It's incredibly hot here. I suspect we're in different places around the world, but here in the UK, it's extremely unlikely how hot it is. And I have an office with big, big windows, and it's been like a greenhouse in here. So that's kind of can take us to Palestine, which is what we're going to be talking about. So 20 years ago, Peter Gandy, who I just saw a couple of days ago, which was lovely, and myself wrote a number of books, starting with the Jesus Mysteries, which was our big bestseller. It kind of changed a lot of things for us. And it was a book which was presenting a radically different understanding of our Western tradition, what this Christian religion, which most of us have been born into, have experienced, and all of us are in a culture which has been dominated by. So I want to, this evening, sort of revisit those ideas a little bit. And I want to thank Richard, first of all, for suggesting I do this, because it's not something which I focused on for a while. And I'm thinking that what I'll do is I'll do it in 4 sections, and I'm hoping that that will cover a little bit of everyone's interest, because which is I want to look at the history, but it's going to be brief. I want to look at the mythology. Again, it will have to be brief. I want to look at what it means, and I want to look at how it's influenced my emergent spirituality, my philosophy that I'm exploring now, and why, although I rarely talk about it as such, it really is a kind of neo-Gnosticism, I think, or can be seen in that way. So I'm going to move very quickly through those things in the hope that then I can open up a conversation in which you can draw my attention to what you would like to discuss, and you may have come with things which I'm very, very happy to do my best to engage with, or there may be things that come up, and we can let the conversation focus anywhere and everywhere that you want it to in the time we've got available. So hopefully that's a good plan. And let's start with the ground, which is history. So the Jesus, I can't see everyone's picture, so it's pointless me asking how many people have read the Jesus Mysteries. But the essential, Richard, you have, that's great. There's a few people waving at me that I have got pictures. The essential Jesus Mysteries, as Peter and I called them, is essentially this: that the root of Christianity is not in a miraculous coming to earth of the Son of God. But actually, that sounds like a myth, because it is a myth. And not only is it a myth, it's a myth based on pagan and Jewish mythology, which had been around for a very, very long time. Now, apart from people of faith, people who believe it because they choose to do that, they choose to believe based on their reading of the New Testament, I think amongst scholars, for it has been for hundreds of years, a feeling that there is a huge amount of mythological elements in the Jesus story. One of the things I often is that if we never read this story, if we never come across the idea that there was a guy who walked on water, came back from the dead, had 12 disciples, like the 12 constellations and all of that, if we hadn't seen it, never read the story, then and I was here now going, oh yes, I'm a Gnostic scholar, and I've got this old Gnostic manuscript that's been found in the desert, and this is the story it tells. I don't think there's anyone who would go, oh, that sounds likely, I bet that happened. I think we jump straight away to, oh, well, that's an interesting piece of mythology. What does that mean? And it's because of our cultural heritage we don't do that. And even for me and Peter, I have to say it was a big jump. It's so embedded in the psyche. But I don't think there's any serious scholars now who don't think that there's a huge amount of overlays. So the argument really for the history is not to do with, is the Jesus story a myth? The vast majority of people actually who have studied this, nearly everyone, believes it is. The question is there a real person underneath the myth, and therefore some of it may not be mythological. Jesus wasn't born at Christmas, to use a very obvious example that most people would go with. That's the solstice, and so on. And that's been overlaid later. the question for me, that's how me and Peter addressed this same issue when we came across it. We ended up making a different suggestion, which was there was no historical Jesus. And the reason, in essence, for that, I think, is the combination of a lot of elements. Firstly, if you look deeply into pagan mythology, and indeed Jewish mythology, the ideas in the Jesus mysteries tend to focus around the idea that it's pagan mythology, which is the same as the Jesus story. Not just one myth, of course, but all the elements that make it up. But in Jesus and the Goddess, we also go through some of the Jewish mythological precursors. Once you do that, there's really not a lot left. So that you're thinking, okay, so how would you tell if there was a real man underneath there, given that there's all of this seems to have been mythological elements seem to have already been in existence? And so one of the ways is you can look for historical evidence of a man. Now, clearly for the miracles and stuff, we have nothing, but surely there should be something, maybe some record of something in the Roman records perhaps or elsewhere, and we don't have any. That's the fact of the matter. What we have is faith documents. What we have is a lot of later Gospels, which are misunderstood as eyewitness accounts, but any scholar who looks at them realizes very quickly they're not. We have Mark, which is the earliest, which is clearly put together by someone who doesn't know Palestinian geography. They're all written in Greek. I suggest they're being written in Alexandria, probably, not by people in Palestine. And that has been copied and embellished in Gospels attributed to Luke and Matthew. I say attributed because in the originals they're not. It's much later that we get the ideas that these are written by certain people. And then we have John, which is completely different and much older. None of them agree about very important details around Jesus' birth and his death. And that's kind of key. So we haven't got historical documents, we've got faith documents. When we do find Jesus cropping up in history, it's with people, most famous is the historian Josephus. I say historian. The propagandist probably is be a better description now. Historian is how he was seen at the time. But there, the stuff about Jesus has clearly been added. The Greek changes. It's added, and the earliest mentions of Josephus don't mention Jesus being there. So Jesus appears, and I think that's a surefire sign that people, even in the early centuries, were desperate to find some evidence for something which didn't exist. The other two elements then which come in is to go, who were these people called Gnostics? Now, we call them the Gnostics. They did not call themselves the Gnostics. But you can see in the early church these two, well, I say early, by the 2nd century, you can see these two different schools of Christianity, broadly speaking. One of which Peter and I call literalists, because their key claim is that Jesus literally came. Actually, let me just stop here, because I think this is probably one of the most convincing arguments for the idea of the mythology, and how when people think it's outrageous, we call it a myth. The earliest Christians, the earliest literalist Christians, acknowledge that the Jesus story is the same as pagan stories. Right from the beginning. This is not something that we've made up 2,000 years later. Justin Martyr, people like that already claim, oh, look, we tell the same stories as you. The big difference which they add, their new thing, their selling point, is that they come in and they go, but ours actually happened. A few decades ago in Palestine, this story of the dying and resurrecting God-man actually occurred. And that's a radical claim, especially because it's so recent. But it's only made by a small handful of what will become literalist Christians. Those are the people that will be influential in Rome. They will become taken up by Constantine as his mother becomes a Christian, and they will become the Holy Roman Empire. They put together the Bible from literally the hundreds of Gnostic Gospels which exist and other Gospels. They put together the only ones that could sound if created modern Christianity. The offshoots, Protestantism, doesn't matter how radical, the offshoots are from that. That's their foundation. On the other hand, we have these other Gnostics, which we call Gnostics. It's these other Christians we call Gnostics, who see the Jesus story as an allegory. They're very clear that this is something, it's about discovering, as Paul says, the Christ in you. Paul, just in passing, much misunderstood figure, I think, because there's two Pauls. There's a Gnostic Paul and there's a literalist Paul. So the early letters of Paul, which are the earliest Christian documents, specifically Christian documents that we have, are completely mythological. There's no historical Jesus, and they're about discovering the Christ within you. They're written in the Greek of the ancient mysteries, and Paul is the great hero of the Gnostics. These are the people that see their great heresy is that Jesus did not come in the flesh. Jesus did not come in the flesh because he is as Jung would say 2,000 years later, he is an archetype of the self. They didn't use that language, but that's what they're saying. He represents, just like Dionysus and Osiris and Attis and Mithras and all of the pagan dying and resurrecting God-men, he represents you, the initiate, on the journey to gnosis, or mystical knowledge, knowledge of self or knowledge of God, which turns out to be the same thing. So for Paul, it's the discovery of the Christ within. Paul is the great hero of the Gnostics. They claim he had a secret teaching, which is transmitted to them. A Gnostic like Valentinus claims that Theudas was his master. Theudas was a student of Paul, but there's no Jesus involved in any of this. Much later, you get letters attributed to Paul which attack Gnostics. And I think that's a sign of how influential Paul was, that there needed to create these later letters where you have a completely different Paul. And that's the Paul that we often think of when people complain that Paul somehow invented Christianity. So with these Gnostics, you have this completely different version. This is an ancient myth. It's an allegory, and its job is to take you to gnosis. That's its whole purpose. So that's, I think, the question is, who should we listen to? And there's this, the Gnostics are so widespread. There's so many of them, all sorts of different groups as well. They wouldn't all agree with each other, very much like mystics generally, individualists. They're doing their own thing. Some think you should we should all be aesthetics. No, we should all indulge in the senses. You've got everything going on. Some are basically Platonists, some are off on quite some sort of Jewish thing, and they seem to have been around for a long while. So I'm going to pull all this together and say, look, what this all points to, I think, is that everything evolves, and that our Western tradition has evolved like all traditions, and that there's not some great chasm between ancient paganism in the Mediterranean and the sudden launch of something new, Christianity. But actually, there's a continuation of influence, which is where there's a eclecticism between different traditions is happening. And we have these documents which are definitely that. Everyone would acknowledge that, which are called the intertestamental texts, which come between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they're full of pagan and Jewish mythical motifs, all pushed together. Why? Because they were being written by Jews who speak Greek, which is the language of a universal language by then. They're in Egypt, this ancient pagan culture, and there are a lot of them. It's like New York in Alexandria. There's a big group of Greek-speaking Jews who are doing what? Doing what mystics always do, synthesizing their own tradition with the one around them. And they create the intertestamental texts. So what Peter and I are saying is not really that radical. We're just going, well, this is another one of those. That Christianity starts as another attempt at that. They take this figure in the mysteries of Moses, which they were definitely practicing. There's a group we know outside of Alexandria called the Therapeutae, who are they are Pythagoreans, and they're practicing Jewish mysteries. And they are practicing the mysteries of Moses as an initiatory journey, not to be taken literally, so that the whole idea of the Exodus from Egypt into the Promised Land is about the journey to the realization of Gnosis, the awakening. And of course, the figure that takes you to the Promised Land is not Moses. He dies. The figure that takes you to the Promised Land is Jesus. or Joshua, which is in Greek is Jesus. So I suspect they've been practicing the mysteries of Jesus for hundreds of years. The difference is they don't want this violent Jesus, which we have in the Old Testament, this nationalistic figure, which serves Yahweh, this Jewish God. They find their Jewish God an embarrassment because they're embedded in Platonic culture, this incredible philosophy of oneness that you come with the Neoplatonists and the whole Pythagorean tradition. So they jealous God, he's crippling, they don't like him, and they need to deal with Yahweh, and they do that by saying he's not the real God. And so people who are serving Yahweh are not serving the real God. The real God is the oneness. It's Plato's God. It's the oneness of all things, and that's the God that Jesus comes to reveal. He's a God of love. So they replace this patriotic, violent Joshua, Jesus from Exodus, with this Prince of Peace, this mystical Jesus who comes to reveal the God of love and the God of oneness, the God behind Yahweh, the real God. So I think what's happening is that's where Christianity has come from, and then it's been turned into this literalist cult, and that's been picked up by the Roman Empire. It could have been a Mithraic cult. It could have been maybe even an Egyptian cult, but the one that was picked up was the Christian cult, and that dominated Western Europe for 2,000 years since, and has played an amazing role because in its heart there's teachings like love your enemies. There's the idea that God is love. I mean, these are monumental Gnostic ideas, and I would claim that they have brought about the best in our culture. They have given us what is best in our culture, and they're still doing it today. But along with that, it went through a filter of the Roman Empire, which it was a domineering fascist empire, and that has implanted over it things which have given us some of the worst in our culture. And which is why this wonderful tradition which they started can be used for great good, and how also can be used and has been used for great evil, because its own history has come from goodness and then got into the hands of and been distorted into the hands of people with a very, very, very different agenda. So the whole journey for me and Peter is not to diminish Christianity, but really to go, look, this is something incredible, and if we can understand it, it can set us free. So if we just look for a moment at some of the mythology in there, I mean, there's the thing about it when you get into it is just about every detail is carrying a message. And we can play with some of those, and, and also we're guessing as to what they are sometimes. Sometimes they're obvious. But the overarching one is well, this is my favorite description. It comes from Plotinus, who is a Neo-Platonic philosopher who's attacking the Gnostics. He's attacking them because he's so close to them. And he's a pagan philosopher, and they're Christian philosophers, and he's attacking them because, like I might attack someone I'm very close to but disagree with. There's plenty of people like that. And they're stealing his students. He doesn't like that either. So he's laying into them. I think he's a great philosopher, Plotinus. And he says, look, this Christian thing, it's just about the ascent from the cave. That's what it's about. And a modern ears hearing that would go, what it's about the ascent from the cave? It's what? But that's exactly what it's about. It's about the ascent from the cave. So I'm going to just enter into that one myth as a way of getting into understanding how this works mythologically, because I love that so much. So in Pythagorean mythology, which becomes Plato, the universe is the cave of which we have become lost, and it's the night sky was seen as like a veil, and that's Nuit. If you think of the Egyptian goddess, the goddess with all the stars on her, because the goddess is the whole of all the forms. The God principle. I mean, maybe I should just state here for those that don't realize, in the Gnostic version of Christianity, there is a goddess, which I think is like, when I first found that, I just couldn't believe it. No one had told me. But there's a female element. called many, many names. My favorite is Sophia, which means wisdom. But the goddess goes right back to the pagan tradition, obviously. And you can see that there's this fundamental male and female polarity. And Simon Magus, who's perhaps one of the earliest Gnostic Christians that we know of, describes it as everything arises from mind and thought. So there's this one mind, and that's God, that's the male principle. And then there's the thought, or the dream of existence, and that's the female. So it's the formless and the form, mystery and the manifest. These are the two principles that come to that create existence. And in the mythological mind, they could look at the night sky as a veil, behind which, well, there were little holes in the veil, which you could see light coming through. And that was the mystery. That was the treasure house of light. That was God behind the veil. And the veil was all of the forms, the dream. There's the dreamer. This is the dream. And we've fallen into the dream. And we need to wake up. We need to come back to life. So the mythology of Christianity starts with Jesus being born in a cave. We get stable, but it's cave. Catalina. It's a cave. As is the same in the ancient tradition. It's Plato's cave. It's Pythagoras' cave. It's the cave of the universe. He's born in. Have this lovely idea in everyone. It goes back to Egypt. Everyone is a star. And now you can see it's not some stupid, crazy, nutty idea. What they're saying is everyone is a hole in the veil through which the light of the mystery shines. And I often think of that when I'm doing the gazing that I do a great deal in my retreats, because you're literally looking through the veil and seeing something beyond the veil, something you can't see. You see just the face, but you connect with something beyond. And that's what they're saying. They're going, look, you are a conscious being. You're not in the forms. You're formless. So you're like a star. You're like a hole in the veil. So Jesus comes, and there's a big star, huge star, of course, because he's the perfect initiate. And he comes into the cave. Mary represents Sophia. Sophia has two forms. She's mother and daughter, just like God is father and son. And so this is the quartet that is in the original mythology. And she represents the forms. So Mary is the goddess who's sometimes called Justice. She's at the mouth of the cave, and her job is to bring souls into and out of incarnation. She's also where Jesus is on the right hand of God. You've heard that, I'm sure, many times. So the goddess is on the left hand of God, and she will put souls back into incarnation out on their journey as they come in and out, in and out. So Jesus comes back in. She's often portrayed as a virgin in the pagan mythology. So of course, Mother Mary is the Virgin Mother. The other Mary, Mary Magdalene, is also very important. They're the same figure, because Mary is the world soul. She's all the forms, the cosmic soul, Plato calls it. So there's one soul, which is the one dream. And then there's all the fragments. There's your dream, your soul, your individuality as a psyche, as a soul. And that's the daughter. So the mother is the whole thing, and the daughter, which applies to all of us, men and women, is the individual psyche or soul. And that individual soul is what is got lost. So in the Gnostic mythology, you get this figure of Sophia who's lost in the world, desperately looking for love in all the wrong places, has a terrible time, gets raped and abused and suffers, has an awful time of life, as so many of us do, and then turns her attention back to the Father and says, help me. And he sends the Son, Jesus, to rescue her. And that's his role. So he comes as the Son, to the initiate, to rescue the soul who's lost. So he comes in, he becomes, he's purified through baptism, which is the first level of initiation. That's the initiation into the psychic or soul initiation, which is about your purifying your individuality. And he becomes the Gnostic teacher then. And that's when in that phase, he gives all of his teachings about love and forgiveness and, wonderful teachings, some of them. How many times should you forgive somebody? just endlessly. You should, if someone hits you, let them hit you again on the other side. These are radical ideas. You should not only love your neighbors, you should love your enemies. I mean, wow. So he's coming in with these beautiful, he is the philosopher, the Philosophia, the lover of the goddess of wisdom. In fact, when he's initiated, the dove, which always represents Sophia, comes down into him and fills him. And he becomes, at that point, he becomes the teacher. He's initiated. And that goes right the way through then until he performs all his miracles and blah, blah, blah. And he comes back in then as the king. He comes into Jerusalem riding the donkey. Now, this is very significant because the donkey in Egyptian mythology is set that at this time when this was being done, they would perform this ritual where they'd take a donkey and they would throw it out of a tower. Horrible to our modern ears, ghastly. But what they were doing with that is they were mythologically telling the story of the dark side of existence, Set. And in this instance, it represents that Jesus is the king. The Christ just means king, by the way. That's what the word really means. It means anointed king. So he's now the king. And so he's on his donkey as the king because he's mastered his lower self. He's mastered Set. It's the same as in the Zen tradition on the 10 bulls, when they see the Zen initiate riding into town on the Zen bull. But same thing. He's riding into town on the donkey. He's mastered that, and everyone's hailing him. Now, before that, what he's done is he has done a lot of things, but one of the things is he's purified Mary Magdalene. Well, Mary Magdalene is Sophia, and he's taken out 7 demons. Why 7? Well, because today we know them as 7 chakras. Of course, they didn't call them chakras, but it's the 7 heavenly bodies representing the 7 levels of existence. You get this in Mithraism, you get this in lots of pagan traditions, and Jesus has purified Mary on all these levels. Well, Mary's the soul, so he's purified Mary, who is the soul who's fallen into, she's a fallen woman in the story. And she's now elevated, and in Gnostic mythology now becomes the teacher of all the other disciples. When Jesus dies, she is the one who will reveal the secret mysteries to all the other slightly stupid disciples, all the men. Why are they stupid? Well, they represent the 12 aspects of the zodiac. Zodiac on which soul is going round in the wheel, round and round and round. Jesus is the still point. He's the North Star. He's the star that doesn't move, the stillness through which everything moves. And the awakening, the discovering of the Christ within, is you go to the center. You find the place in you which doesn't move, around which all of this passes. So she's the awake soul now. So she's the vehicle that can take all these other people through the secret teachings to the Christ within. That's her role. So she's now the apostle to the apostles. She's the one. She's gone from being lost to being the wise woman who can reveal the Sophia. And she is the one, if you remember then, who anoints Jesus as the Christ. She takes the oil and anoints him. He's done his job now. Now he's ready. So having done his job, he can come into Jerusalem riding his donkey, hailed as a king, Hosanna in the highest, everyone's out in the streets. He's at his height. And of course, it's all going to go horribly wrong. At that point, the story is just going to completely invert. And he's going to have to be ready to sacrifice himself completely to die. Now, what this is about is the next level of the initiation, which is the pneumatic, which means spiritual, essence, being initiation. The psyche psyche initiation is the soul, all of the stuff which makes us up as an individual. And then having come to know yourself as an individual, you're ready to take the bigger step and go, am I even an individual? Is my true identity greater than my individual identity? And that's the discovery of, I appear to be Tim, but on a deeper level, I am one with God. It's all God. And that is the jump out to spirit. And traditionally, and it's still said, I mean, I've come to disagree with this actually, but the ancient tradition, for reasons we can explore, was very much this was about a death, and that you had to actually, die to yourself. And that's exactly what Jesus does. But even on the cross, of course, we have this image of him just like this on the cross, but the Gnostics have this image of the laughing Jesus. that whilst Jesus is being tortured to death, his friends have betrayed him, the crowd has turned against him. I mean, it's suffering. They've portrayed this awful suffering, and also in their world, quite a common thing, and a kind of a common criminal. Not, it's, you know, we have a romanticization of it because it's the cross, it's significant, but it's not significant. It's just another guy being put to death as a common criminal. And this is very powerful. But what they have is this image of the laughing Jesus, because they also portray Jesus, the deep Jesus, as in a cave of light. And he's laughing, which is, but he's saying, look, I appear to be this man suffering, but I'm not really. The real me, it doesn't suffer. And because I know that, it's okay. And that's why he can be in that position, even though he's suffering, to still be in love, to go, they don't know what they're doing. Literally, they are in ignorance. They're not in gnosis. The people who are doing this are in ignorance. And therefore, he can extend that love, that all-embracing oneness, through even that process. And then to finish our story of the cave, we then have his death, which is the pneumatic initiation. And Paul says he has conquered the cosmos. Go back to the star. He's conquered the cosmos. Now, if you remember in the story, what happens is there's a rip in the veil of the temple. Now, the veil of the temple was at that time a tapestry of the night sky, because they were obsessed by astrology. And so the night sky is opened up, and Jesus goes through back to the treasure house of light. He is beyond the cosmos. That's the whole point. He's no longer in form. He has seen that his essence is not form. That is what the awakening, the gnosis, is for all of us still. It's that stepping out into that place where he's gone beyond form, and he's free. He's done it. So that when Mary Magdalene, the soul, goes to the tomb, the cave is now empty. It's gone. He's not there. He exists beyond form. So it's about the ascent from the cave. He has left Plato's cave, Pythagoras, and he is now free. Now, this goes on in the Gnostic version, and there's a next step, which I'll mention very briefly because it's beautiful, which is, it doesn't end there. It doesn't end with the resurrection. It ends with a mystical marriage, which brings all of what they call syzygies, all the opposites, together into one thing. So it's the marriage of the male and the female principle, Jesus and the goddess Sophia, coming together. And that one of the beautiful ways that's represented is that he comes back. And his awakening, the word in the Greek for awaken and resurrection are the same word. So his resurrection, his awakening, is in the body. He comes back in the body. And I think that is a mythologically very significant for us, because it's not actually just going out and leaving behind the cosmos. It's actually then, having done that, coming back in. And that's in form. Now this deep realization. So let me just bring together a little bit of what I think that all means, and then say a little about where it's left me, and then I can go wherever you would like me to go with where it leaves you. So one of the big things which has still affected me, perhaps they're all going to come in together here, it was when studying this Gnostic tradition that I finally got something blindingly obvious, so obvious I can't believe it took me until I was that old to see it, which is that this ancient terminology, of which you get various versions, but the one which is obvious is soma, body, psyche, psyche. I'm told it's actually pronounced by the Greek. Psyche, psyche, which is soul, and pneuma, spirit. These three levels, body, soul, spirit. That these are not theological terms. they have become theological terms. In what I mean by that is they become things we theorize about. But the starting place is actually a pure description of the obviousness of our experience. And this has been hugely influential for understanding Gnosticism, and then for all of the philosophy I've done since, including emergent spirituality. That if you look at your experience now, these three things are obvious, and you can do it with me now if you haven't done it before with me. There's body, here it is, the senses. There's a world of the senses, at the center of which is a sensual body, listening and looking and thinking. And there's all these different senses, but they come together to form one world, and you can't miss it. And then there is another experience we're having all the time of psyche, soul, which is a world made of images and meaning. There's no meaning in this world, the senses. It's all in the psyche, memory, imagination. It's an imaginos, a world of images, and we're always in it. So when people say they don't believe in the soul, I don't know what they're talking about. You cannot even know what the sentence meant without psyche or soul. The soul is something completely obvious. And then there's this third element, spirit, which means essence or esse, being. It's this deep thing, and that's the experiencer of body and soul. That's it. This is the ancient teaching. And the experiencer has no form. It's outside the cosmos. Because it has no color, it's not a thought, you can't hear it, it has no tangible nature, because it's pure being experiencing this. And that's the essence of Gnostic mysticism, and actually all mysticism of all traditions. And that to understand Christianity, it is an initiatory process. It takes you from being what they call a somatic or a hilic, which is when you're identified with the body. I am this thing. And at a certain point, that shifts. And you enter another stage where you go, oh, actually, I'm really this disembodied soul, which is not made of matter. It's made of ideas. And what really is important is that I clarify, perfect, purify my existence as soul. And that's the the soul initiation in the tradition, which is about becoming a better person, learning to love, forgiveness, morality, just becoming a good soul, looking to the good, not to your own self, but looking beyond your own self. And then this completely other mystical big jump where you go, oh, actually I'm spirit. Actually, I am the formless presence witnessing of consciousness or spirit being witnessing this. And when you see that, you see that because your essence has no form, it's not limited. It has no boundaries, and it is one with all spirit. So the great secret at the heart of, say, Hinduism is Atman. The individual self is one with Brahman, God, and exactly the same in the Gnostic tradition. It's that when you discover the Christ, it's the discovery of individuality. The very essence of your being is one with the being of all. That you are one with God, which is what Christ proclaims. I and the Father are one. And that's true of everyone who experiences that pneumatic awakening. And the agape, which I tend to gloss as big love, that universal, limitless love, is what arises from that recognition of oneness, which is why the true God for the Gnostics is a God of mystery and a God of love. And you get this line very clearly in John, God is love. And those that live in God live in love, and God lives in them. I mean, just exquisite in the letters of John. So a few words about how all of that has come together to form an evolutionary philosophy 20 years later, which for people I think would look quite different, but for me is a kind of neo-Gnosticism. Well, firstly, you get the idea that I ran with a long time, which is the great mystical idea that I started with, which is two principles. which is that everything, form is existing within formlessness, and or ideas existing in mind is the metaphor. So I've taken that and wrote about it at great length, but eventually went, let's just go with form and formlessness. That there's something which is but has no form, and I called it potentiality or spirit, and within it is arising this evolving flow of form, and that is the essence of emergent spirituality. There is an evolving flow of form arising within formless potentiality, and everything is coming into being or becoming. And this is pure Plato. Plato has those two as being and becoming, something which is but has no form, and something which is never the same twice because it's becoming, and that's the evolutionary process. And it feels to me like that we can understand these ancient ideas, this mythology, in a new way, with what is in a way our new mythology, which is this vast idea of an evolving cosmos, 13.8 billion years of evolving cosmos. And the other idea, which really came into focus from my meditations on the Gnostics, and maybe I should just say this because you might find it interesting. I do, that one of the great teachings for the Gnostics is no one's you come to your own understanding by studying the mythology. And really, what I think happened for me was that I immersed myself in this mythology and came out completely different from that process with my own understanding, and that's just carried on and on and on. And this is so I feel like what I've done is a Gnostic process, exactly what they intended, but just 2,000 years later, and involving. And I've syncretized, just like they did. They syncretized paganism with Judaism. What I want to do is syncretize that with science and do exactly the same thing. Interesting that science and gnosis are the same word in Greek and in Latin. They both mean knowledge. They're the same word, but into these two different schools from which our cultures come. And one of the key ideas that occurred first for me with Jesus and the Goddess is this idea that we can understand the journey of existence as one from an unconscious oneness through a conscious individuality, the arising of form becoming more and more conscious through its individuality, and arriving then at conscious oneness. And that fundamental insight has generated everything I've done since. That's the overarching mythical arc, which is right there in emergent spirituality, which is why I've got this idea of God coming at the end as the conscious oneness. And in that way, I've done exactly the same as the Gnostics. This guy at the beginning, he's Yahweh. He doesn't make any sense. I don't like him. He's a monster if he's at the beginning. So forget him. It's arising from potentiality and turning into the God of love. So I feel like that's the agape. That's a wonderfully Gnostic notion, I think. And I see in the Christian tradition generally something which is often missing in the East. I love the East as I do, and it's been so influential. But what the Western Gnostic tradition gave us was the importance of individuality, that it's through the individual that we awaken to the one. And I think you could make a very cogent argument to suggest that the reason that modern civilization and individuality has taken off in the West is because of that. That what held back the East, when they had this huge, amazing culture, but why they got stuck was that they were stuck in a sort of collectivism, which we broke through due to this spirit of individuality, which is where more consciousness comes from. Now, our job now is to finish that process off by finding the oneness through it, which is a return to conscious collectivity. That's our big challenge, not to get lost in endless individuality only, but through it to wake up to conscious oneness. But I think that's where it may have come from. So I think that's another huge strand for me in this neo-Gnosticism. And then there's resurrection of the body, which I've already mentioned, which is, for me, key for my deep awakening, which is we don't wake out of this, we wake in this, that we bring the love in, and that it's not the mysticism of withdrawal, like you're seeing in so much non-duality, is a negative life-denying mysticism. And maybe last of all, but probably more foundational than any of it, there's more stuff, but I'll let that come out later if it wants to, is this idea again that I mentioned about syzygies. It helped me have confidence in an intuition I'd had for a long time, which is that we need to understand life as a paradoxical duality and oneness at the same time. And the Gnostics have this idea throughout their mythology, which they call syzygies, which are what I would call paralogically connected pairs. And so the idea of paralogical philosophy, which had been so important to me leading up to the emergent spirituality, by the name, you could call it dialectics perhaps, as well as lots of names for it. It's the coexistence of opposites. So one version we've already explored of that, I'll mention that one, is that the whole of existence, Simon Magus, 2,000 years ago, Simon the Magus, saying there is two principles, the male principle, the female principle. The male principle is spirit, consciousness, and the female principle is form. One is being, one is form, like an idea in a mind. This is a good analogy for it. And that, and he says, in fact, I wonder if I can actually find it. I was looking at it just before I'm not going to, no, I won't spend time doing that now just because time's so short. But what he says is, and I'll have to paraphrase him, he says, these things from one perspective are two, the mind and the idea, and from another they are one. And I'm sure you can get that right now as you're thinking. That in one way, the idea you're thinking right now is two. There's you, there's the consciousness and the thinking. And in another way, they're one. They exist together. They interpenetrate. So my courage, which I think it has taken, to present this new emergent spirituality, and this is only just beginning. There's a handful of people that have even heard of it, and half of those disagree with it. But that has been to me a very inspired by the Gnostics, because that's what they did, and faced by incredible odds, which I don't face. They took the best in their own culture and they married it to the best in the cultures they found around them, and they created something new, something which was both poetic and mythological but deeply philosophical, which gave birth to all sorts of things which have influenced our culture, some of which have been good, some of which have been bad. The good bits, though, are really worth treasuring. And at the center of that is this idea that we wake up through body, to psyche, to spirit, to oneness, and that is then about love, and that we come back in with that love, and that we're in a process. We're in a process of what I would call the self-realizing universe. That this arising of form from formlessness is realizing this deep potentiality, moving us forward all the time, and that we can, through this process individually, wake up to the God within us, which is a beautiful, beautiful vision. And we can discover that whilst you are you and I am me, there's also one of us. And that is still, to me, the most profound idea. And then as you experience it, the most astonishing reality. Whew. Okay, my lovers, I covered a lot of ground. I hope that was okay. And we've gone for about 40 minutes. So, 50 minutes. So now seems like a good time with the rest of our time together to go, look, I can take this wherever you would like to go. I've only received one question by email beforehand, and that was from Robert. But let's see what anyone else has got to say first, and then I'll definitely come back to Robert's before we finish. So if you'd like to say anything or comment or ask anything, just wave and Richard will magically allow us to talk.
Yeah, or people can unmute their mics, and Robert just put his hand up.
Okay, Robert, let's connect with that question you sent me.
Well, sure. I asked about Carl Jung
Yeah.
and spirituality as uh, a Gnostic direction, but I'd just like to uh, expand on your um, connection with Plato, because Plato in the Republic has the concept of the noble lie, that is the story for the masses that provides an initiation path into spiritual gnosis. And so that's very much my reading of the Gospels, that they're a public story that points towards a process of initiation. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Tim.
I think absolutely right, Robert. That's exactly the Gnostic thing. There's the inner mysteries and the outer mysteries. The outer mysteries are well, the Gnostics say they're for children, but but that would be the same. That they are about pistis or faith. So you get told this story. You know, I mean, I don't want to be trivial with it, but like we're told the story of Father Christmas or something. You're told stories, and they are meaningful to you. And then at some point, someone takes you aside and goes, "Here's the truth." And the whole Gnostic initiation would be, okay, when you're ready, which may be when you're quite old in some cases, then you actually get told, no, this isn't about somebody else. This is about you. You are the initiate. You are Jesus. And I think that's exactly what they're doing. And so when I said earlier in the mythology, in books like the Pistis Sophia, Faith Wisdom, the figure of Mary Magdalene teaches disciples the mysteries. That's what she does, and that's her role as the wise soul, is to reveal these allegorical mysteries. And you can see it in people like Clement of Alexandria, where they're looking to explore the allegorical meaning of all of these motifs.
So one of the issues around the Jesus mysteries is that the modern discussion around was Jesus a myth has been closely associated with atheism, and yet you're not presenting an atheist perspective, although very much a scientific perspective. And so reading a range of the American authors such as Richard Carrier and Earl Doherty, Robert Price, there's been this great sort of opposition to spiritualism, but you're saying that there's a deeper spirituality with it through the Gnostic tradition, which I think evokes a continuity with the sort of methods that Carl Jung was interested in discovering the Nag Hammadi literature.
Again, I completely agree with you, Robert. So, in some ways, we were lucky. Our book was read by a lot of people, which is always a great privilege. But we also fell between two stools, because what was taking off was a big argument, as you say, between atheists on the one hand and religious fundamentalists. And Peter and I were in the middle going, well, our book is dedicated, the Jesus Mysteries is dedicated to the Christ in you. This is not an attack. This is actually going, look, what is this actually about? And wanting to actually reveal great depths to the original Christianity. And I think that's very much in the spirit of Jung. Yeah, and Jung, as you've said in your email to me earlier, he's he's got this view right from the start. There's no historical Jesus. I don't think he has that. He's an archetype. And you asked me to comment on that idea, how that fitted in with Gnosticism. And my sense is that it's the other way around in a way, that I think Jung was getting these ideas from his Gnostic studies. I find it wonderful and interesting that he wrote Seven Sermons to the Dead under the pseudonym of Basilides, which is a great Gnostic teacher. And so we've got Carl Jung, who is one of the founders. Well, there's two, isn't there? There's Freud and Jung. It's almost mythological. Who are these founders of what will become modern psychology, the study of the soul. One of whom wants to take it, studying ancient myths, the ancient Greeks, and going, they're alive in the depths of our being, but we must stay scientific. And Carl Jung, who's also kind of doing that with the scientific thing, but also having all of these mystical experiences and writing under the pseudonym of a Gnostic and having paralogical phenomena happen around him. and all of that. So I think what he's seeing now, for me, what it's given birth to is this idea in Soul Story, in my emergent spirituality, that the past is present. And I think if Carl and I would have had the chance to sit down, which we've done a couple of times in dreams, but only in dreams, and have a discussion, then I think he would agree and probably tell me a lot of things I hadn't seen, because there's the sense in which what the collective unconscious is the past, and it's not gone anywhere. You know, right back to the ancient gods, they're in us. Everything that has been human is in us, and the past is accumulating in the present as new potentialities are realized, but the moment is informed by all that's happened before, and the soul is the collective soul that my individual soul is riding on, is extending from, evolving from, is made of everything that's gone before. So what's in the past? Well, all of the archetypes are those repetitive themes, which, although every story is different, they're underneath all of them. Mother, father, old wise man, all these kind of trickster. These are common themes which are so embedded in human experience that they've become the very foundational tools with which the soul can imagine and then eventually can think. So I think he's a genius, and a genius for me. The reason why Carl Jung is a genius, although of course I don't agree with everything, but there's not a point. None of us should agree with everything. What he does is he makes the journey himself. He's not a commentator on life. He enters into the actual journey of soul evolution wholeheartedly. And so many of the people who comment on all of this are as if they're standing on the edges, not in the mystery. They're not in the mystery making the journey. They're as if they're outside, as intellects observing it. And that's how I find all those other writers that you talked about looking at Christianity. They feel like that to me.
Thanks, Tim. Look, I hope hopefully other people have comments.
Yeah, anyone else there? Thank you,
Chloe,
Robert.
Go back to unmute Chloe. Also, just to say,
Do
I'll
we have
unmute
time?
whoever's on the phone,
Chloe.
okay, because I don't know if you can unmute them yourself. So the person on the phone, you're unmuted now. But Chloe, please go ahead.
Oh, am I unmuted too now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Chloe.
Oh, okay. So, Tim, I wondered if you could, sorry, there's a bus going by. I wonder if you could tell us more again about the marriage of, I think you said, of body and soul, maybe in the resurrection. Because, was that what you said?
Yeah.
I don't know.
What did you have in mind with that? Just give me a clue as to what you're looking for.
Okay, well, so I'm you know, it makes sense to me that that at the moment of death, you know, that Jesus was his soul was leaving his body, of course, and ascending to some a different plane of understanding, or you know, of gnosis. But then what you're talking about there with returning to his body, I don't feel I understand the meaning of that. Yeah, basically,
Okay.
I'd like to get more of that.
I'll have a go, and you can tell me whether any of this helps.
Yeah, I don't know if that.
So there's a form of mysticism which is about withdrawal. So the whole purpose, you can see it very clearly in, say, Theravadan Buddhism, which is about going back to the treasure house of light, the emptiness, nirvana, the formlessness. So you're stuck in form, you're a soul, you're going around on what they call the wheel of karma, what we in the West called the wheel of grief. It's the 12 disciples again. It's you're going round, around, around, and you need to get off the wheel and go back to the formlessness and dissolve like a drop into the ocean. That's that whole. Now, what happened in the East was that gave birth to Mahayana Buddhism. Bear with me, I know I'm talking about Buddhism here, but may help.
Okay.
Where you get this idea in Mahayana Buddhism which goes, no, that's the greater vehicle, because they take in more, where you get this idea now of the bodhisattva. So the idea is no longer now to get off and become this, to just get away from it all, to free yourself, liberation. It's now engagement through compassion, metta, love. So you come back into life to be a vehicle for love. That's the bodhisattva ideal. So that's what happened with Buddhism. The same thing happened in the West. You get this from this idea of the body as a tomb, which you see in Plato, and you need to get away. You get this idea that no, you need to come back in because of love. So you're coming back into form, you're coming back into separateness to marry everything together. So you're not getting away from form, you're engaging with both form and the formless at the same time. And that's the mystical marriage, to bring all of these opposites together at the same time. You span the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah, because I think what I'm struggling with is like, how does it sounds like such a mythical kind of, that there can only be a mythical rationale for this part of the story. And so what kind of, how can it, I don't know.
What does that mean in spiritual experience?
So, well, so no, I think what I'm actually getting back to is, how can that be part of a literal story as well? What justification, how do you think literalist Christians are seeing that part of the story? What's the point of that for them? And how does that then tie back into the spiritual experience? Okay,
well, I think literal Christians have a lot of different ideas. One of them, of course, is that at the end of time, everyone's going to come back in their body, which is it's quite a common and slightly spooky idea. That when the last judgment is called, then all of us will suddenly find our bodies miraculously brought back together. All the atoms are, there'll be a lot of us by then, won't there? We're all going to get very confused. But anyway, you get this, like the resurrection in the flesh is an idea which that's one of the things they took from it by taking it literally. What it's about really is mythological. That's the whole point. And it's so you get the idea of Thomas, doubting Thomas, who wants to see the holes and wants to see the flesh, and it's like, oh my God, this has really happened. Now the other element which is in there for the literalists is being added later, and it's been added. Why? Because the first thing that anyone's going to say in the ancient world, or now, if you go, yeah, I followed Jesus, he came back from the dead, they're going to go, yeah, really? How do you believe that? And oh, no, look, they tested it out at the time, it was true, and that sounds naive to us, but people are quite naive. And I think that was one of its elements for literalists. But for Gnostics, I think it's always been about the coming back into form, that it's not just that you come out. And what that means in the spiritual experience is what I do at my retreats, which is to attempt to take people to a point where they can experience their deep being, and then from them come right back in to each other in a very embodied and tactile way into love, so that when we leave, we're all of that, that we're not rejecting one to gain the other, we're marrying them all together.
Okay, yeah. I think I missed one little thing you said there, because it keeps breaking up on me.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay. So you said that the key thing for literalists, that second one you said? No, I don't know.
The key thing...
I think it was the moment about... I think you were going to say the literalists put it in, the thing about Thomas poking the holes, because it makes it look like, they tested at the time, because it broke up for everyone at that second.
Oh, brilliant.
Okay, that's what it meant. Can I just point out to you all, in case you haven't noticed, that our wonderful host, Richard, has put that quote from Simon Magus on the notes miraculously.
I just sent it to you, Tim. I'll send it to everyone.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, send it to everyone. He sent it to me. So I'm going to read it to you, and you'll see it.
I just knew it in the back of my head, so I wrote it out.
Good man. That's so impressive.
It looks awesome.
This is the actual quote from Simon. Everything manifests from two emanations, consciousness and thought. Male and female in essence, they are one. When separated, they appear as two. There you go. Not bad for someone 2,000 years ago, is it really? Pretty good. Anyone else want to take us anywhere? Well, let me just say that one of the things which really appeals to me, maybe I'm just making it very personal, and this might be of interest for the last part of our gathering here, is one of the things that's come back with, on my own journey, I've followed pretty much the ancient initiatory path without realizing it, or not realizing it in advance. So that there was a movement of waking up, huge period of personal exploration, and then and I knew the oneness was there because I touched it, but then the revelation of it in a big way, and suddenly like, oh, that personal stuff is irrelevant. It's all the oneness, and that's the non-dual realization which a lot of people are experiencing now. And then coming back in, and my journey back in has been going on for the last 10, 20 years now, and it's still going on. It's still getting stronger. And one of the things I lost along the way, which was the figure of God. I didn't lose it, but it's very important to me in the psychic or the phase, the soul phase of that journey. Most of my experiences of the oneness was relational. I was in relationship with it, and it's beautiful because it's a devotional relationship, and it's one of love and immense support. So you just feel like surrounded by this love. And when I described the experiences when I was a child, waking up at 12, it was that. When the oneness that I experienced wasn't really the oneness of later years, it was a relational oneness, a relationship to something greater that was holding me. And then with the non-dual part of the journey, which is the pneumatic, that went into the background because it was all one. There was no separateness. There was no me and something to relate to. When I go to the deep places, it was just this presence. And that was the love. But as I've continued that into this other phase, God's come back. In fact, I can remember just suddenly saying the words, God's back. And suddenly, although God had never gone anywhere, this feeling of relational experiential with this greater being was there. And that became a very important part of the emergent spirituality eventually, when I wrote it, probably 10 years later. 7 years later, of trying to say, how can I explain this God? And coming, as I said, very much from the same Gnostic problem of the traditional God at the beginning of time is an insane monster who can't make his mind up, because he must be to have created a universe of this length of time with 5 great extinctions and immense suffering. So he's not the God that I experience. So where's this God come from? And then this huge jump, not made by me, of course, like every idea I'm sure is precursored. And you can see in great Christian thinkers like the Jesuit Pierre Terre de Chardin, who had this insight many decades before me. And I think it's kind of implicit in Jung as well, that it's that there's somewhere we're heading, which is God. So that's happened, and then out walking not that long, there was a moment where I found myself saying, "Oh, Jesus is back." Which was very interesting to me, because I'd left Jesus behind when I became Mr. Jesus. The great thing about being a success is everyone wants to keep you in a mold. So I became a success. I'd written an international best-selling book on Jesus, and I was Mr. Jesus, and that's where I had to belong, and I didn't belong there. I'm that's the Gnostic spirit in me. I don't belong there. This is about the essence of things. I have to move on. And I kind of left Jesus behind. He showed up again to write the Gospel of the Second Coming, which was fun, but hadn't been around for some years. And then I found myself in a very powerful relationship with Jesus, because from a Gnostic point of view, he is, as Jung said, an archetype of the self, and he is particularly that in the Western soul. And the great thing about that an relationship with something which has no form. So in the great mythologist Joseph Campbell talks about these figures as masks of God, forms through which we can connect with the formless. And the mask we connect through is the one that's right for us. And there's something about Jesus, which is obviously has been and is sometimes right for me. And the great thing is I can have my own Jesus. The terrible thing about being a literalist is you really mustn't think too hard about things, because if you do, you're in trouble. Because one of the things you will very quickly realize is that if there was an historical Jesus, he probably wasn't your Jesus, because everyone's got a different Jesus. So the chances of you having the right Jesus are very slim. It probably wouldn't. The real Jesus probably wasn't like you think he was. He might even not have been very nice. You might not have liked him. He might have been the opposite of what you think he is. You might be a fire and brimstone Christian, but Jesus might have been a kind of wimpy pacifist. Or you might be a wimpy pacifist, and Jesus might have been the fire and brimstone. It's like it could have been all these things, or a politico, or the real man may be a massive disappointment to you if you're a literalist. But the great thing about the Gnostic perspective is you can say, look, he's my Jesus, and he represents my own daemon, my own genius, my own deepest element, which is one with all. And he becomes then a vehicle through which you can have a relationship, a human relationship, with something which is beyond humanity, something which is beyond our imagination, this being of love which is beyond, it transcends me. And because it transcends me, it transcends and includes me, I commune in it. It's trying to imagine it is like, a cell in my finger trying to imagine Tim. It's like, that's not going to happen. But these images from the soul give us doorways. And much to my surprise, I found myself in relationship with Jesus, and it was lovely. And took me back to when I almost became a friar when I was in my 20s, and hung out so much in the chapel and did all of that with then a literal Jesus. But he was the same Jesus, actually, as the one that was with me, because he was always been my Jesus, and that's exactly who he should be. That's the way the Gnostic thing works.
Tim,
Yes.
could I pick up on your discussion of mythology?
Yes.
Because in the modern world, a myth is a false belief, and yet you're talking about myth as a source of meaning. And so it seems that what you're doing is a new paradigm of mythology, so a framework of understanding. And so you're restoring the concept of myth as a source of meaning for life.
I do hope so, Robert. Yes, I love you. The way you articulate things is so clear, I think, and I resonate with what you say again very strongly. So in the ancient world, that's what myths were. They weren't. One of the things I think is difficult for us is because everything evolves, and part of that evolutionary process is individuating. So literally the whole of life is individuated from hydrogen, pretty much, into all of these different forms. So everything's individuated, and that happens culturally. So what you see with culture is that things that we now think of as distinct were once not distinct. Natural philosophy was once science and religion together, but then they split. And one of the things that just split is mythology and history, because it's not that the ancients don't really have the idea of history like we do. So it's not that they are fools or they just get taken in. It's just, I don't think it occurs, they haven't got the same. It's impossible to imagine not having these ideas now, because we've had them for so long. But they were the people that gave us those ideas, and so they had to evolve. And a lot of these people, so mythology was seen in a completely different way. But I think we can get a handle on it today anyway, because we live in a world full of myths. I mean, more than ever, in the form of stories, in film and literature, and some of that is trivial nonsense, but a lot of it, much of it, carries allegorical meaning, makes you think, and these are myths in that way. And we are still, and when people create those myths, they do the same thing that the ancients do. They go through all their favorite myths, steal a few great ideas, put them in a new order, make them slightly different, and offer them back. That's what evolution is. That's what creativity is. And that's what the Gnostics did. Exactly the same. Oh, we'll have a bit of that and a bit of that. Oh, we'll put that in. That's good. And then later on, someone added something else, took something else out, changed it around, put in a new passage. Great. Have a go at that. And we're doing the same thing. and to see that the allegorical meaning then can be so profound, especially when we're addressing those elements of life that science really struggles with. Science is really, really good at the basic levels because they're more repetitive and can be easily quantified. So physics, brilliant. Biology, not so good, but still pretty good. Soul, wow. Now we're, immediately you get into that realm. You can still be rational, like, say, Carl Jung was. And you can still be taken a view of looking at the actual evidence. Actually, you can't quantify things, in the same way. When you do, it becomes statistical and it's something else. So to be able to enter into that world, this is where mythology really helps us, and poetry as well, same sort of thing. How are we doing? So is there anything else which has come up that anyone wants me to address before I draw us to a conclusion after our little Gnostic adventure? Yes.
Tim, it seems like that can you hear me?
I can, Richard.
Okay, good. It seems like one of the things that we as creatures crawling around on this planet now need to do is to realize that our own individual concept of our life, we need to start looking at that as a myth too, because so much of what I'm discovering in my later years too is that all these things that I thought were so important, really not very important. There's just a lot of old stories being, stories being used in the tribal sense to get the ire up of the tribe so that they can go out and kill the enemy. It's almost that same kind of thing, only it's going on just in here, in my head.
Yeah. We need to see stories as stories, and then we need to work really hard to make the best story. Yeah. And that's where we need, all of the doubt we can master, all the wisdom we can bring together to create the best story. There will always be the mystery and the story. That's a syzygy, to use the Gnostic word. They exist together right now. And you can see that. I mean, you can see that. I was with Ian McGilchrist recently, who wrote The Master and His Emissary. I went up to the Isle of Skye for a conversation with him. And he's done a lot of work on the left and the right hand of the brain. Now, I don't want to get into that too much, the whole subject, but one of the things which that brings up is a syzygy. Whether it's linked to the left or the right hand of the brain doesn't really matter, but there is a syzygy, which is there is part of us the whole time, which is perceiving totality. And then there's a part of us which is conceptualizing that into a useful map. And you absolutely need it. Someone said to me the other day, oh, we don't need that. And it was like, well, they're all wrong. And it's like, of course they are. Because if I had to, if I had to give someone a map from how to get from here to London, it actually, as it is, it'd be like any map. It will be it can't possibly capture the granular nature of the little twists and turns and each pothole and this and the trees it's just infinite to describe. And even if I could, which I couldn't, it would be useless to them because it would be the actual terrain. What they want is head down the A303 and, turn left when you reach the end, which is like, there's reality and there's that. Well, but that's what we need. And that's what you're talking about, the stories we tell. So then it becomes, okay, a story serves a purpose. So that's one thing. What story serves what purpose? And how do all the different stories fit together? And what's the overarching story, which to me we can call the philosophy that contains all the stories? And then let's make them as good as we can to bring us to the greatest evolutionary potential, bring out the greatest goodness in us. And what you're saying, I think, is very common. As we get older, I've certainly experienced it. You look back and think, wow, I've been laboring under some very limited stories here. And I'm beginning to wake up from them. And the solace I take in that, for me, Richard, is that the process of evolving, of waking up, is of necessity looking at how asleep I've been and just thinking, wow, and so I've turned it around now. So now I hope that I'm feeling that right to my last breath. On my last breath, I'm going, oh man, now I really see. God, what was I thinking? Because that will mean that this process will just keep continuing and continuing. And I'll have that same thing that I'm getting. I think it gets more, doesn't it? It just seems to get faster and faster, this looking at myself and going, wow, what was I thinking?
Laughing a lot, though.
Laughing, well, because you get to the point where once you've got over once you got used to humility or humiliation, perhaps, then you don't have to take yourself so seriously. And there's a great joy in being wrong because you find something good. Whereas at first there's a huge resistance, isn't there?
Yes. Is this also what you mean by the road back in? You mentioned that just a few minutes.
Yes.
Road back
in.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. So that we don't disengage. Right. We actually engage with the process. And that's where the love is courage, really. I was thinking just the other day, I've just run this retreat and we entered the big love, as I have to say, always happens. But then there's always this feeling of, why are we always in this? And why doesn't the world know about this? And God, we need to wake up and feel the agape, feel the big love. And my feeling is because there's two responses to the ambiguity of life. Life is bittersweet, isn't it? And there's two responses. You either fall in love with its sweetness and enter in and have the courage to engage with the bitterness because of the love, or you do what a lot of us do, most of us veer between the two, you just retreat because of the bitterness.
Which is essentially what addiction
is. Just sweet. Precisely. And we all do it in different ways because we're looking for can I get away from this? And so when we look at the love with mysticism, there can be this is there a place where there's just love? Great, can I go there, please? Whereas actually, the love is what engages the bitterness because the love gets pulled to the suffering in oneself and others. So it actually turns into courage. It doesn't turn into running away. It turns into running right into. It's actually a place of courage. And in ourselves, I mean, what you described there, Richard, is an act of courage to look at yourself and go, oh, I feel like, this is going on inside me. That's a courageous perspective and one we need to support each other in.
Thanks.
Right. So I am thinking it would be nice if we could just go around and everyone just say a couple of words because we've been together and it'd be nice to hear everyone's voice. If you Richard, could you take everyone through that? And if your mic's not working and you can't say anything, we will just send our love to the name on the screen or the face on the screen. Okay,
so you want the person spotlighted for?
No, just enough. They don't need to be, but just enough to say, to hear everyone.
Okay, I'll start unmuting people's mics. So, Marion, we'll start with you. I can't unmute you. Could you unmute yourself, please? There we go.
I don't know what to say.
Just nice to hear your voice, Marion.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful words. I think it's great. That's the only thing I can say. I'm on a journey, I think so.
Perfect. Thank you. That's just great. I'm so pleased it was a good evening for you.
Barnaby, sorry, I can't. Yeah,
got you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, great. Thank you, Tim. I find myself exploring the challenges of not getting lost in the story and trying to not allow the ego of Barn, the angry part of Barn, who wants to do some scary stuff in the world. Do you know what I mean? To bring the love into the story, really. And yeah, interesting time. So anyway, good to be part of this. And yes, I'll say no more. I might incriminate myself.
Cool. Thanks, Barn.
Okay, Anthony Taylor.
Okay.
You're unmuted.
Great.
We can hear you.
Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful. It's really good to reconnect some ideas. that mean a lot to me. Yeah, there's that struggle for me between waking up and going to sleep and not beating myself up too much for running from the bitterness, because at times it really is bitter.
Yeah.
But having the courage to come back and know that there's always another opportunity to come back. So it was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Robert, I want to read you.
Yeah, sure. Look, Tim, I think that your make me think about the an astronomical framework around the shift from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, and developing a paradigm shift that sees Christianity in that light. So thank you so much. Wonderful.
Right, lovely to connect, Robert.
Donna, I can't unmute you. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. Hi, Tim. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And the time since it's been 2 years since I was with you in Glastonbury, just continue to expand and grow. And this all goes deeper in my understanding. And this today was amazing. So thank you. And thank you, Richard, for facilitating.
Thank you.
Much love, Tim.
Thank you. Love to you too. Nice to see your face.
Chloe.
Well, thanks so much, Tim and Richard, for running it. Yeah, it's my first time doing this with you, Tim, although I feel like I've been getting exposed to these ideas through you and Tony over the years of your discussions and so on. And yeah, for me, it's probably the most meaningful way to think about spirituality that I've come across. And so I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much.
Great. Lovely to see you.
Julie, I don't think you have a microphone. So perhaps you could give a wave if you can catch what I'm saying. Julie.
Hi, Julie.
I'm assuming she can hear us, but yeah. Okay, Richard.
Well, thank you, Tim. I've really enjoyed this. This is the first time I've had to see you speak live, so to speak, and I ran across your books years ago and found them extremely valuable to me. It kind of opened up a lot of doors that I thought they were cracked, but you helped push them wider open, and appreciate it. And it's been a great it's been a great opportunity today, but I'm looking forward to at some point getting over to England to go to one of your retreats, because I just have the feeling that there's a lot more to be opened, and
wonderful.
I like opening doors.
Wonderful, Richard. Well, I'm coming to the States in October.
Oh, that's right. You are upstate New York. That's not too far away. I'm in Maine. So.
Oh, I'm so near to you. Come on. We've got to get together. Take a look at it. Take a look.
I will. Thanks.
Okay, Tim, please.
Hi there, Tim. Hello, everybody else. Thanks for the time. It's the first time I've actually looked into the Jesus Mysteries as a subject on its own, although I've looked at other books on Hermetica, etc., that you've written. I wondered how much of the allegorical story has to be religious based. I mean, can you study these mysteries without it being in such spits religious?
What do you mean? What do you mean by that, Tim? What do you mean by religious?
Can you study the Hermetican principles without there being religious allegory there?
I understand what you're saying. I think you could make a pretty convincing argument that science is that.
Yeah.
It's the Hermetica. I mean, if you think all of the early scientists quote and reference and love the Hermetica, so they're all reading it. And so my suspicion is that science started with hermeticists, or I mean, alchemists, for instance. And so that science really is what happens when you pare away all of the mythological element, what you're left with. And now having differentiated it, now we need to bring it back in and go, okay, so how can we knit all this back in together?
I kind of saw the polarity side of science and religion being the two extremes of the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Yeah, and we need to get the best. And when they're isolated and on their own, they have a negative side. So that science without any of this becomes very blunt and rather dark, and religion becomes irrational and dangerous. But if we can find the best in them both and unite them, and that's what my present work is really all about, then it feels like we could have a great new mythos to go forward, like the sort of thing that Robert was talking about.
Thank you.
Cool. Nice to meet you.
Jessica, I can't unmute you. You could unmute yourself.
Okay, hi. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, great, good. Yeah, I mean, Tim, as you know, I know a lot of your more recent work, but it was really good to just like listen and find out a little bit more. I haven't read the Jesus Mysteries yet, but just get an idea of how your past research and understanding has led to kind of where you are now on your belief system. I mean, everything you were saying about kind of the link with Sophia and Jesus, and then Mary Magdalene and the 7 chakras and the disciples and the zodiac and all of that, that's all quite new to me. So I think I'm going to do a little bit more research into that and read your book. Yeah, I find it fascinating, really, kind of looking at how ancient some of these kind of religious beliefs and ideas and allegorous stories are, and when you start looking at the net and the connection between all of them, you know, the fact that you brought all of these kind of different beliefs and Buddhism and whatever kind of.
Oh, we lost you, or I've lost you
Okay.
anyway.
Yeah, that's a proper freeze up there. It was very
okay. All right. Well, lots of love to Jessica, and hopefully she can hear that. Thank you. We lost you for a moment.
Yeah, we lost you.
You're back.
Are you back? Great. I just typing message saying thanks. It was great.
Great. Marvelous.
Thank you.
Okay. Russell, please.
Morning. It's early here, but I've certainly enjoyed the chat this morning. It's been very thought-provoking. I would dearly love to attend one of your sessions, but it is a long way to come for me. I'm down here in Australia. But I certainly have a lot of homework after this, Tim.
Wonderful. Well, I very much hope that one day I will make it to Australia. I haven't done, but I would very much like to do that. So stay in touch and maybe we'll get to meet one day.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tim.
Pleasure.
George, I can't unmute you either. Would you go ahead, please?
There we go. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Tim, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating and very enjoyable evening. And I've been reading your work now for the last several years, your early works and your more recent books. This is the first time I've had a chance to see you and Richard live. I'm usually following you along the pre-recorded videos. I will certainly be checking out the replay of this one. I've taken a lot of notes. There's a lot that I've missed. And I want to go back and make sure that I get all the benefit from this wonderful session. And I just find that you're helping me connect a lot of the dots of many things I've been studying and reading since I was a teenager. And I'm grateful. And one of these days I will get over to England. I'm over in Prague. And it's not too far for me to jump over the channel. And I'll see you one day in England. Thank you. And thank you,
Wonderful.
Richard, for coordinating.
Cool.
Thank you. And finally, sorry if I mispronounced it, Misa, I can't unmute you, so would you be able to unmute yourself? Okay, Misa sent a message saying thank you, it was great and I really enjoyed it. I don't know if the microphone is working, so.
Okay. Great, well I'm pleased you enjoyed it. I would, I'd like to end by reading something, it occurred to me, which is the first paragraph of the second book, Jesus and the Goddess. I'd like to read the first paragraph. It just felt like a really good thing to end on, because I think it's something I wrote that I really, whenever I read it, I think, yeah, that captured something for me, and it feels like a good place for us to end. So firstly, thank you for all making the effort to join me and being part of this. And this is my final thought for you. Life is a mystery so awesome that we insulate ourselves from its intensity. To numb our fear of the unknown, we desensitize ourselves to the miracle of living. We perpetuate the nonchalant lie that we know who we are and what life is. Yet, behind this preposterous bluff, the mystery remains unchanging, waiting for us to remember to wonder. It is waiting in a shaft of sunlight, in the thought of death, in the intoxication of new love, in the joy of childbirth or the shock of loss. 1 minute, we are going about our business as if life were nothing special, and the next, we are face to face with profound, unfathomable, breathtaking mystery. This is both the origin and the consummation of the spiritual quest. Big love from Glastonbury to you all. I hope we get to do this again. Good night.